Since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. Even in our proud 20th century, after all the technological miracles of the past 100 years, an estimated 700 million people, almost half the world's population, are completely cut off from modern civilization. They can neither read nor write. They live in the netherworld of illiteracy. Almost half the world's children do not go to school because they cannot. There are no schools for them to go to. Multitudes are starving not only in mind, but in body, because man's oldest sources of food supply have been squandered, abused, abandoned. Others starve in the midst of potential plenty, because ancient prejudice and habit are opposed to fruitful methods of production. While 2/3 of the Earth's surface, a princely storehouse of food, remains still virtually unknown, untapped, unharvested. In Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, at home, we are all impoverished by ignorance and neglect. We are all endangered as the gap between the haves and the have-nots, the tragic inequalities between men and between nations, becomes increasingly wider. But for the first time in history, we no longer accept war as an unfortunate but necessary evil. We no longer accept poverty and ignorance as inevitable. We know that war has its roots in the minds and emotions of men. We believe that communication, understanding, and education are the basis for an enduring equality and peace among nations. UNESCO is the United Nations educational, scientific, and cultural organization, one of the United Nations specialized agencies, dedicated to the sharing of intellectual resources among all nations. Its headquarters is Paris. From here, it directs projects in every quarter of the globe. Teacher training, literacy classes, publishing textbooks and reading materials, fostering community planning and development, developing mass communications, instruction in sanitation and nutrition, research in natural sciences, in water resources, oceanography, the preservation of native cultures, and the preservation of cultural landmarks. These are only a few of the many activities sponsored and planned by UNESCO and its member nations during the past 20 years. No one has seen this progress at closer range than Ambassador William Benton, former Assistant Secretary of State, responsible for United States policy in the original creation of this organization in 1946.
Over 90% of our budget, and a very rapidly growing budget it is devoted to the new developing countries. We help them in their efforts to develop their own educational policies and plans. We help them in their new and ever-growing interest in technology and science. And of course, UNESCO tries to help them better to understand their own cultures and the cultures of the world in which they live. Thus, the program in the 20 years has changed from a program of intellectual cooperation among the old and established countries to a program encouraging the development of science, culture, and education in the new countries the 119 countries that belong to UNESCO, most of which are, of course, newly established.
A growing budget, yes, but still a very modest one for its worldwide operation. Because UNESCO's budget is actually smaller than that of a large American university, it must plan very carefully to see that its funds are used to stimulate progress in the most important areas. And surely none of these is more significant than education. In Africa, in Asia, and South America, entire continents are emerging from the dark ages of illiteracy. The number of the world's illiterate is staggering. Even in countries like our own, it remains a serious problem. And in the less developed nations, it often disables 75% of the adult population. Overall, we are talking about nearly half the entire population of mankind who can neither read nor write. The obvious solution is more schools, more places for the youngsters to acquire a basic education. But this will take many years to accomplish, and it's only part of the problem. We also need millions of new textbooks, not only in the major languages, but in many languages that heretofore have actually had no written literature at all. And there is no shortage more critical than the lack of qualified teachers. Many of the men and women currently occupying these jobs have a minimum of education themselves. Goodwill alone certainly won't qualify them to overcome the problems in their areas. Their ranks must be increased and upgraded by professional graduates of colleges and normal schools. This is the reason that UNESCO has used a large share of its funds to stimulate the increase of teachers' colleges. Without a ready supply of well-trained young people to enter the field, new buildings and new textbooks can't possibly have an enduring effect. The best investment is, after all, teachers themselves. And here in Latin America, we see a good example of this principle in action. Since 1957, more than 9 million new places have been made available in schools. Over 250,000 new teachers have been hired. Many of these teachers came from colleges receiving stimulation, guidance, and help from UNESCO. Well-trained young men and women are making a lasting impact on the thousands of communities where they are assigned, offering a personal vision of hope to children growing up in isolated agricultural areas without other contact with the outside world, giving them the indispensable key without which they and their nations cannot enter into our 20th century, the key of education. All of these children will be able to read and write. They will understand newspapers and magazines. They will be able to make intelligent contributions to their governments. Hopefully, some of them will go on to college themselves. They will become the teachers of their generation. Thus, little by little, the seeds sown by UNESCO funds are harvested and replenished over the years to come. Modern technology is also making a contribution in Latin America as elsewhere. Because the supply of teachers is still severely limited, UNESCO sponsors research in the use of mass communications to bring education to children living hundreds of miles apart in remote farms and plantations, so that every mother, every neighbor can participate, perhaps at the same time receiving an education themselves. The problem remains difficult. The population growth in Latin America is the largest in the world. Primitive superstitions and prejudices often stand in the way of effective education. The most advanced methods are not able to dissolve ignorance overnight. But the progress, though slow, is real. Here in Latin America, we see part of a great cultural revolution affecting peoples the world over, the thirst of the illiterate for literacy. Child and man, the human race is determined to bring itself up to the standards of the more advanced nations. No country fails to recognize that its future, the progress and prosperity of its people, depend first and foremost on adequate educational opportunity. UNESCO has pledged to support this underprivileged half of the world in achieving its goal. Through UNESCO and its educational program, we begin to penetrate the darkness of illiteracy. We begin to make this 20th century of ours truly the century of universal enlightenment. More than 2/3 of the Earth's surface is covered by seawater, incalculably rich in raw materials, energy, and food, possibly the answer to starvation and malnutrition throughout the world. The Indian Ocean covers almost 1/5 of the Earth. It is completely landlocked at one end. Along its shores cluster 25% of the world's population, severely in need of food. In 1959, UNESCO, cooperating with the Special Committee on Ocean Research, established the International Indian Ocean Expedition, 6 years in duration, involving scientists from 24 nations and 40 research vessels flying 13 national flags, the most extensive oceanographic study ever undertaken. The United States was an early and eager participant. The data collected and analyzed here may well improve our knowledge of tides, currents, and weather everywhere. It is vital to the continued success and improvement of the worldwide fishing industry, and it may well provide new insight into the availability of rich mineral deposits, oil, and natural gas. Fittingly enough, our American ship was named after a great scientist from another country, the great Danish marine biologist Anton Brun. At one time or another during the expedition, it carried scientists from Brazil, Canada, India, Pakistan, Spain, Sweden, and Thailand, as well as its own American staff. Together with its fellow ships, like the Indian frigate Kistna, it crisscrossed the ocean in carefully predetermined courses that would provide an accurate chart of the area. It is startling to realize in this age of sophisticated jet age navigation, but 95% of the world's oceans are still inadequately charted. Principally, however, the investigation of this phase of the expedition was in marine biology. No one knows where the spawning grounds are of many of the world's most valuable commercial fish. No one knows why the annual commercial catch will fluctuate wildly, sometimes as much as 1,000% in the same fishing grounds. No one knows why some areas teem with life, while other areas nearby are as barren as a desert. To answer some of these questions, exacting measurements must be taken. Depth, temperature, oxygen content, thickness and composition of sediment layers on the sea bottom, the interaction of currents and winds. Among the most important biological clues are the location of enormous percolations of deep water to the surface called upwellings. This surge of cold water is rich in nutrients necessary to the plant and animal life upon which fish feed. Without them, the surface soon becomes sterile. And the tiny organisms themselves, called zooplankton, are collected, categorized, and counted. Amazingly enough, one research worker may have to sort and count samples containing up to 15,000 of these minute specimens by hand. Oceanographic vessels are completely equipped floating laboratories. They may carry 20 scientists on board, and they must be designed to stay at sea without docking for many months at a time. It has been estimated that every day at sea requires 10 more days on shore, analyzing the collections and measurements. We mustn't forget that in the Indian Ocean expedition, we're talking about 6 years. 6 years of work by a combined force of 40 vessels. It will be many years before all the results are evaluated. But even at sea, much of the preliminary cataloging can be done. The nutritional value of various plankton, preliminary diagnosis of various fish diseases, the existence of parasites, the size and general distribution of various species can be recorded, rates of growth and food requirements, and hopefully the discovery of valuable concentrations of seafood protein for the nourishment of mankind. We have already learned of new and extremely rich fishing grounds previously unknown. Other discoveries have been made, significant for better ship design, more efficient trade routes, more accurate long-range weather forecasting, the clearer understanding of destructive typhoons and hurricanes. The International Oceanographic Expedition has already had far-reaching results. It has encouraged and fostered a new dedication to oceanographic study among the nations of Southwest Asia, a study which may furnish them with the solutions to their age-old problems of poverty and famine. Most important, perhaps, all of the information gathered by the Indian Ocean Expedition is invaluable to world scientists throughout the years ahead. This is the raw material from which new theories, new understanding, and new progress may come. It has been said that scientific cooperation will not be effective for any purpose unless it is good science. By the same token, governments are unlikely to support it if it does not serve their interests too. The Indian Ocean Expedition is a promising example of how science can serve itself and the interests of governments everywhere through creative international cooperation. Its success has been so notable that it has inspired a much wider oceanographic research program by UNESCO, which continues today. Although by far the greater percentage of the UNESCO budget is used as a catalyst to spark projects in the fields of education and science, there is another activity which is equally dramatic in its effect, and that is the preservation and exchange of cultural values throughout the world. Many Europeans and Americans are unfamiliar with the history and the cultural wealth of the Orient. Many others know nothing of ours. Much of the great literature of the Far East, and even of nearby Latin American countries, is unavailable in translation. We are obviously shut off from other nations, other peoples, if we have no appreciation of their cultural heritage. This, too, is a concern of UNESCO. One of its most gratifying projects was the establishment of the first truly public library in Southeast Asia in cooperation with the Indian government. This library brings enrichment to the lives of more than 2,000 users a day, 1/4 of whom seldom read at all before joining the library, for 3 out of 5 possess no books in their own homes. Similar pilot projects help to overcome cultural isolation in Africa and South America as well. Although it's true we can't evaluate UNESCO projects by their appeal to the popular imagination, without a doubt the most widely heralded activity which UNESCO has attempted has been part of its program of preserving national monuments and cultural landmarks in Egypt on the upper reaches of the Nile. In 1960, UNESCO summoned the collaboration of 50 nations to save the irreplaceable archaeological riches of ancient Nubia. Portions of the Nile Valley are literally the most densely populated regions in the world. These millions, equivalent to more than half the population of the entire United States, are almost exclusively dependent for their livelihood on the great historic river which cuts a swath of green fertility through the Nubian desert. In recent years, it became apparent that in order to provide flood control, adequate irrigation for agriculture, and hydroelectric power for this vast region, a high dam must be constructed at Aswan in Egypt. This would, in turn, create the second largest artificial lake in the world. But the lake, so necessary to the continuously growing population, would completely flood an area in which rested some of civilization's greatest archaeological treasures. A portion of mankind's finest heritage would be lost forever. UNESCO issued an appeal to all nations. Legally, yes, the monuments and excavations of Nubia belong exclusively to two nations, the Republic of Sudan and the United Arab Republic. But their beauty and their scientific importance belong to the entire human race. It was a unique appeal. Never before had such a thing been attempted. But during the following years, 51 nations and numberless archaeologists and engineers responded. Despite the colossal size of the undertaking, despite the frequent threats of discouragement and failure, universities and museums pressed ahead with the most elaborate exploration of Nubia ever attempted. Engineering firms in Italy, France, and Sweden gave their best minds to the problem of salvaging the best of the ancient structures. Even Abu Simbal, the gigantic temples to the sun constructed by Ramesses II and his queen Nefertari over 3,000 years ago. The statues of Ramesses rise 67 feet above the sandy banks of the Nile. The temples themselves penetrate the cliffs for 200 feet. Their interiors are a magnificent gallery of carvings and fresco paintings, beautifully preserved by the dry desert climate. But as the waters of the Great Lake rise, these superb landmarks embedded in the cliffside would be eternally lost. How was this prodigious weight to be raised and given a new permanent setting atop the higher ground? Many of the suggestions were ingenious, but overwhelmingly costly. Raising the temples intact on pontoons, or giant hydraulic jacks. After careful deliberation, it was decided to cut the temples into blocks, weighing no more than 30 tons apiece, and reassemble them at the top of the cliff. The cost would be $36 million. The United States, urged by President Kennedy, contributed $12 million in Egyptian pounds. Other UNESCO nations contributed $5 million. The United Arab Republic pledged itself to provide the rest, and work began. A cofferdam 300 yards long and over 25 yards high slowly surrounds the temple site, defending it from the rising waters. The temples themselves are carefully dismantled to be raised 200 feet to the top of the cliff. They will then be reconstructed 300 feet further inland. All this dealing with 15,000 tons of sandstone, so fragile that even cutting it with the finest stone saws sometimes causes it to crumble. It is a momentous undertaking, not only for archaeologists, but for the engineers whose most advanced skills are being strained to raise Abu Simbal successfully to the summit. But results in Nubia have far exceeded all expectations. 19 temples have been saved completely, their beauty and historic value preserved for succeeding generations. With few exceptions, the whole lower area of this ancient kingdom has been systematically explored and recorded archaeologically as part of the project. Much important work being done by American expeditions, among others. Further exploration is still enthusiastically underway. Significant discoveries have been numerous. A new chapter in history may well be forthcoming when all the finds in Nubia are ultimately deciphered, classified, and analyzed. This enormous, successful cultural undertaking has used a minimum of UNESCO funds. As in other areas, its own budget has been used principally for planning and incentive, to encourage the nations of the world to join hands in salvaging an area steeped in cultural and historic importance, not only for the Middle Eastern nations, to whom by law they belong, but for the entire civilization of men. There is no life without water, without food for survival. There is no knowledge without exploration, without research, communication. There is no civilization without education. You have seen a few of the multitude of projects through which UNESCO continues to serve these needs of mankind through international cooperation. Dr. Thomas F. Malone, Chairman of the United States National Commission for UNESCO.
The task is large. The means are not always readily at hand. The UNESCO budget is small in comparison with world needs. The gulf between those of us who live in the space age and those who are struggling to leave the dark ages must be closed. Through UNESCO, we can help narrow that gulf, to banish strangeness, ignorance, illiteracy. The United States shares substantially both in the fruits and the labors of UNESCO, and continues its contributions in funds, but even more importantly, in the involvement, the contribution of know-how by scientists, educators, and many others, motivated and united in the firm conviction that cooperation in education, science, culture is in our national interest and will contribute to the understanding among nations that will provide the foundations for an enduring peace. For further information about UNESCO, its meaning for you, what you can do for UNESCO, please write the United States National Commission for UNESCO, Washington, D.C.